Today we'll be talking about the reproductive system. The reproductive system is defined in the dictionary as the organs involved in producing offspring. In women, this system includes the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the cervix, and the vagina. In men, it includes the prostate, the testes, and the penis.
So to begin today, I'm going to be talking about the male and female reproductive system, and then we will talk about what everything does and the physiology of it all. So let's start with the basics of the male model. This is the testes, which is enclosed by the big sac called the scrotum. This is this big sac right here. The layer attached to the testes is called the epididymis, which connects to the ductus deferens, also called the vas deferens. It leads to the seminal vesicle, and together they form a short passage called the ejaculatory duct. From here you see the prostate gland, which contains the first segment of the urethra, which is called the prostatic urethra. When exiting the prostate, you pass the pelvic diaphragm, this segment over here, and this segment is called the membranous urethra, which you should recall from the urinary unit. Finally, the last segment of the urethra is called the spongy urethra. You should also know what this tissue closest to the penis is called, and that is the corpus sponginosum, and the other outer tissue is called the corpus cavernosa. This is this one right here. So now I'll point out the anatomy of the female reproductive system. Let's start here with the ovary. There are obviously two in the body, along with the fallopian tube, which is connected to it right here. The fallopian tube leads to the uterus, which is this big part right here, and this part is called the fundus, which you should know. Another part that you should be aware of is the isthmus. It's a little hard to pronounce, but this part is closest to the cervix, which is also recognized as the neck of the uterus. The cervix leads to the vagina, which is this big long part right here. But before we get there, I'll point out that this is the fornix. These big two right here, these little wings. This is the vagina opening, which is also called as the vaginal orifice, kind of like office. And you should also know that the small part here is the clitoris. You should also be able to recognize that this is the urinary bladder, this big part right here, and that this is the urethra, and finally the urethra orifice. Obviously, this is just a big brief view of the anatomy, and it's a very large topic, so I highly suggest reviewing it when you go to the library.
Now we're going to take a deeper look into the male reproductive system. This is a diagram of a sperm. You have the nucleus, mitochondria, and the tail. The mitochondria within sperms are larger due to their need for the energy, so the tail can swim them up to the uterus and hopefully fertilize the egg. We then move on to the testicle. A testicle is responsible for making male gametes, sperm, and the hormone testosterone. The testicles are located outside of the body due to their sensitivity to temperature. Within a testicle, there are roughly about 250 lobules that are loaded with tightly coiled seminiferous tubules, which are also known as sperm factories. They are made of a stratified epithelium surrounding a central fluid-filled lumen, and they contain Strolli cells that nourish the developing sperm cells and Leydig cells that are surrounding the tubule that secretes testosterone. Sperm are the opposite of most cells, in which they develop on the outer edge and they move inwards as they mature towards the lumen. Now we're going to move on to the erection process, also known as ejaculation. It's controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. It's defined as the propulsion of semen through the duct system. It picks up fluid from the seminal vesicles and the prostate gland, then propels it in a series of rhythmic wave-like contractions. We're now going to move over to the meiosis of the male reproductive system, which is called spermatogenesis. It starts out as a spermatogonia, which is also called a stem cell. It then becomes a primary spermatocyte, which goes through meiosis 1, and then becomes a secondary spermatocyte, which goes through meiosis 2 and comes out as spermatids. One daughter cell can create 4 spermatids. The spermatozoa has a head, which contains the DNA, an acrosomial cap, which contains enzymes to allow the sperm to penetrate the egg, a midpiece, which contains mitochondria and contractile fibers, and then the flagellum, which is also known as the tail. The path of sperm through the body is formed in the seminiferous tubules, then it matures in the epididymis, and then after ejaculation, it is forced through the vas deferens, ejaculatory duct, prostate gland, and then out through the urethra. Now moving on, we're going to talk about the hormonal controls. The hypothalamus produces gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which controls the release of FSH and LH. LH targets interstitial cells and causes the production of testosterone. FSH targets sustenticular cells and causes spermatogenesis. Moving on, talking to clinical problems, testicular cancer more than often ends up with an orchectomy, which is a removal of a testicle. And then you have the cryptorchidism, which is the non-descent of a testes. So that means that the testes did not drop into the scrotum. Then you have impotence, which is also known as an erectile dysfunction and can be treated with meds. And then you have BDH, which is when the prostate gets big and it's hard to urinate, which can then turn into prostate cancer if the enlarged prostate becomes cancerous.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the female reproductive system. First of all, we'll talk about the vulva. It consists of the mons pubis, the labia minora, and the labia majora. And then on the inside is the vagina. Its purpose is to provide a passageway for menstrual blood and a baby to leave the body and for sperm to get in. Next, we'll talk about the ovaries. The ovaries produce and release female gametes and sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Each ovary lives in a sac that consists of the tunica albugina, which is made of connective tissue, and the germinal epithelium, which is made of cuboidal epithelial cells that are part of the peritoneum. Each ovary contains a cortex and a medulla. The cortex houses developing eggs, and the medulla contains most of the ovary's blood vessels and nerves. Next are the ovarian follicles. Those contain a primary oocyte inside supporting follicle cells. It's important to note that a female is born with all the premature eggs she will have in the whole span of her lifetime. Next, we'll talk about oogenesis, which is a fancy word for egg creation. It's the process of the oocyte. At birth, the oocytes stop developing until puberty, and at puberty, the oocyte is ready for fertilization and the menstrual cycle begins. Now, it's important to note that the menstrual cycle is different from the ovarian cycle, and here are the differences. So, the menstrual cycle happens in the uterus to prepare for the fertilized egg. The ovarian cycle, on the other hand, is the maturation of the follicle and egg, and it is the process that drives the menstrual cycle. So here are the steps of the ovarian cycle. Oocytes mature from primordial follicles into secondary follicles and into tertiary follicles. The maturation of the oocyte takes about 14 days and ovulation occurs. Now, atresia is a programmed self-destruction of the ovarian follicle when they're predetermined before puberty that it will not ovulate. So on that note, we'll go back to talking about ovulation. The follicle will eject the oocyte and will then deteriorate. The oocyte begins its passage through the fallopian tube and into the uterus. The uterus is composed of 3 layers: the peritoneum, the myometrium, and the endometrium. The perimetrium is the outer layer, the myometrium is the inner layer, which the middle layer that contracts during birth, and the endometrium is the inner layer of mucosa. And finally, the menstrual cycle consists of the menstrual phase, proliferative phase, and the secretory phase, which all takes about 26 days.